Let the record, much better, thank you. Let the record reflect that we do have a quorum, and the meeting is called to order, and we will begin with a moment of silence, please. Thank you, and if you'll all rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Behind the screen.
It's back there. I pledge allegiance.
Oh, he's got one. Hold on.
Oh.
All right. Good.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
Under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks.
thank you. Well done. Okay, this is a time set aside for announcements from members of the GPAC. Are there any announcements to be made this afternoon? Very well. Then we have no presentations and we have no consent calendar this afternoon. So we will move on to public comment. This is a general public comment period. Any member of the public that would like to speak to the committee on any topic whatsoever, please come to the microphone, give us your name, and we'd love to hear from you.
Good afternoon, Bill Martini, Morro Bay. And I think first a quick question. On last meeting, you were discussing the Harbor Front Master Plan, and I wasn't sure on your old business if that was coming up again today or if you're moving on to ESHA, because my comments are for last meeting. So if this is the appropriate time, I'll comment. If it's going to be readdressed, then I'll wait until that time. And so.
I'm not sure it's going to be readdressed at this level, but it certainly will be readdressed in other forums.
Then I'll just, the area that I'm actually talking about is Special Planning Area B. Originally it was Special Planning Area A, and they kind of switched between A and B. At the last meeting, the staff referred to Special Planning Area G. That's another part of the town. So whether they had the wrong area or mistook G for a B, I just wanted to first clarify that up. This area is approximately 20 lots on Main Street from Acacia down to just past Walnut. And it's a subdivision that was subdivided in the 1920s. It's bayfront lots. Originally, it was a industrial zone mixed residential back in the 80s. The bulk of this property from the bluff up was zone residential R1, and below the bluff is zone waterfront commercial. Special Planning Area B is the overlay that says it's restricted to water-oriented uses. On your on the map on the area, it shows the entire area mixed use, which is wrong. It actually should be a split use. The zoning map is inaccurate. There is an actual survey of the bluff that was done in the 20s that shows the actual survey between the commercial and the residential. The commercial is about a 50-foot strip along the waterfront, almost unusable. The remainder is residential. On the map, it shows it half commercial and half residential, so the map needs to be corrected because it gives a false impression of half the property. Well, I mean, it's all mixed use, and then it shows half of it incorrectly as commercial. I went to, when I've dealt with the banks in the past, they tell me it's commercial zoned. It's not. So there's a lot of confusion out there. The other is the R1 zoning. I had heard rumors as far as making the R1, R2, R3. I think the neighborhood is not compatible. it should stay R1. The actual area there is virtually all built out. The property we own about 6 of those lots of the 20 lots. Of our lots is we have an old cannery, a grocery store, and a home on it currently. Those are all in the residential zoning, but the point being is it's already built, and so as far as intensifying any residential zoning there, I don't think it would be compatible, and then I know the neighborhood is against any upgrading of the zoning. So those were a couple comments that I think need to be corrected on it, and as far as even the commercial zoning, I know there's talk in the future wanting lateral access. The access in that area, they've been saying it's going to go over the bay. The reason is we have a couple residences that are 5 feet off the water. They're non-conforming, but they're official residences. They're grandfathered in. 2 neighbors to the north of us both have homes that are about 5 or 10 feet next to the bay. So there's no room to actually put any lateral access on the land because it's already built on. And so anything in the future would be pushed out into the bay as far as lateral. So I think when you're dealing with lateral access in this area, and I know the harbor's talking about that, it needs to go over the water. And it would really be lateral access also to nowhere, because south of there is no place for it to go.
Okay, Bill, I think your time's up. If you
That's
could
no
kind of
problem.
wrap
I
it up.
didn't hear that. Okay. But just some points on that area to clarify. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have no unfinished business, so we're going to, oh, I'm sorry.
Hi there, Clark Kaler, property owner in Morro Bay, and I think I'm probably also referring to the last week's, I don't know what the process is, but at any rate, I am concerned that the property that I own is going to change from what I understood it to be, which would be a C2 and a visitor serving commercial uses. I'm the owner of the Sun Bolton building, so I think that's Measure D, or Area D in the Beach Street specific plan. I'm not 100% sure that it's D. And I've talked to a number of property owners in that area, and when I come to Morro Bay, I'm excited about this place. I come down Beach Street, and I look out at the rock and the beach. And so when I think of a 30-year general plan, I think visitors are going to be coming down Beach Street to whatever Duke Energy is going to be. We are in love with the beach and the ocean, and that visitor serving commercial has the most latent potential for all of the downtown Morro Bay, I think, is this underutilized, forgotten jewel where at the end of Surf Street, our street right here, has the best view. That's where the view deck should be. That's where the visitors are going to want to come. The view that's taken on the website is taken right in front of my building on Beach Street. Those are the views. That's where Ken directs traffic from the beach, because all the visitors are coming up and down that. And I think community commercial in that location is inappropriate, and it is a downzoning from what I certainly bought those buildings to someday raise the money to do something that I have a dream and a vision for, which is only going to be compatible in a visitor-serving development. Of what kind, I don't know. I live in San Francisco. I see what happens when if anybody's been to Princess Park or these places, our culture, the tech people, the rest of the world that's coming and discovering Morro Bay, we're just going to have more and more visitors, and they're all going to want to go there. So I was very alarmed when I saw that redesignation of what I think is clearly the visitor-serving commercial 30-year general plan. That has to be that way. So that's my opinion.
Thank you, sir.
Can I ask a question?
Wait till the end.
Good afternoon, Kristen Hedlund, 498 Yerba Buena Street,
here in Morro Bay. Thank you for letting me speak. I have a question about their property at 3300 Panorama Drive, the 10-acre parcel. I was looking through the documents, and correct me if I'm not viewing this right, but it says that the California red-legged frog is no longer listed on your GPAC document, and the 3300 Panorama property is a 10-acre parcel that has been designated for the California red-legged frog. And then the other document, it's attachment 3, where it shows, well, my concern is the riparian habitat. There's none listed there, and there is a riparian habitat. And also, I just want to make sure that, I couldn't find this, but I just want to make sure that the 3300 Panorama 10-acre parcel that currently has been designated as an environmentally sensitive habitat remains as that, and it's not changed. And if it's changed, I'd like to be notified. And then just the other item is the Texaco property on Main Street, North Main Street. It's currently an R3, and I think it should be lowered to an R2. That is would be a major impact for the area with traffic. Del Mar School is there. We have the stoplight at San Jacinto, and if you're there in the morning and you're trying to get to work or drop off your kids, it's really would be a nightmare if on that 10-acre parcel it remained R3, where you had possibly over 200 homes, which could equal, 300 plus cars, all trying to get in and out in the morning. And I'd like you to make sure you take a look at the traffic report regarding that being R3. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Travis Kinney. I'm from Atascadero, and I own a piece of property actually kind of next to Clark on Scott Street. I'm kind of new to this, so I was informed by Clark, and I'm in the process of designing something on that piece of property, and it looks as if the way that it was designed, that my piece of property will now not be able to, I had an architect talk to the city prior to starting this. It looks like I might not be able to build what I've already considered building. Therefore, I'm kind of on the same spot as Clark, as that area is kind of a big mesh of houses, commercial. I mean, we're at the end of this. We're at the end of the street, and it's so many different things. And to not make it visitor serving, it doesn't make much sense to me. I haven't really dug into this overlay track thing that he's talking about because I'm too busy. But so that was just my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Betty Winholtz. Overall, I want to say that it's really difficult to take this piece of the zoning and know what we're losing or gaining because there's no side-by-side comparison with what currently exists. And I can spend hours doing that, but because you're paying these people big bucks, I think they should do that for us, and we should be able to see what's changing over to, from what we have to what they're proposing. And I would very much encourage the commission or council to ask for that. Specifically, on 17.24.030A, they're asking the planning commission to do something annually, which I think is unrealistic. I'm not going to get into detail so I can get all my points in. On 17.25.060A, currently we have, and I don't know if it's an understanding or if it's actually just a policy or if it's an ordinance, but our signage on property that's being developed or being posted for development has to be of a certain size, and that's not in this document. In 17.27.080, I think this is where we're talking about neighborhood compatibility. It doesn't mention that language, and it's very, very general. I see nothing specific about the kinds of things this town has talked about that they want. And I see nothing in here about appeals and how that works. And then my last piece of comment is about the ESHA, and it's about the maps. And some of your colors are so close together, you can't distinguish which is which is a woodland, which is a riparian area. Your colors need to be more drastically different from each other. That would help me, and I think others read it. I didn't see anything about the land around the high school being ESHA, and I believe that it currently is. One, because of the monarchs behind it, and because of that creek that's behind, or the runoff, whether or not you call it a creek there. But Bayshore Bluffs is not on there, and the Heron Rookery occupants, the Herons, have moved up into the Bayshore Park, and I think that needs to be taken noted of. It's inconsistent from one map to another, whether No Name Creek is on there, and it's the creek that Kristen had talked about that begins back on Panorama and then flows down to Main Street and across over under Toro Lane. And that, I think those things need to be consistent. Cerrito Peak is not consistently labeled as ESHA or woodland or that kind of thing. I think that needs to be addressed as well. Those are some brief comments. I'm really impressed that you're trying to deal with ESHA and zoning in the same meeting in 2 hours, actually less than 2 hours. And if that gets extended, that would be really helpful to the public, because that's a lot to deal with.
Anyone else who would like to speak at this time? Seeing none, then, we'll bring it back to the committee. We have no unfinished business today, so well, let me just ask, before we move on, let me just ask, would staff like to respond to any of the points that were raised?
Well, there was some issues, brought up related to zoning twice. Both on Market Street, we haven't proposed zoning in that location. We've dealt with only land use, the land use maps for the general plan and the LCP. So we haven't gotten to that point yet, so I don't know if there's any inconsistency there. I think we'll be rolling out zoning, further on down the road to implement the land use plan that the GPAC has seen and that the council has authorized us to move forward with. The issue that Bill Martini brought up, I had talked to him previously about that, and once again, he's not differentiating. Although the mapping issue that he brought up was interesting, I wanted to see if I could find a copy of the survey that we might have done to maybe better delineate those areas. But short of that, again, in that area, we haven't gotten down to zoning level either. We have a mixed use designation over it because those properties are mixed use, as opposed to split land use designations. We were trying to avoid that. And so the zoning probably will be split, though, because of the uses and trying to maintain that single-family residential zoning along the Main Street frontage. Like all the other, properties that are there, they all have single-family homes basically fronting on Main in that location. So that probably does make sense. So my guess is, as we get down to that, that point in zoning, we'll discuss that further. But I would imagine that's where we're going to end up. And then the other portion of it is on the waterfront, and that allows for commercial-type uses. So it sort of makes sense that you have two different things going on there.
And speaking of the lateral access, do we have a coherent plan that will connect the state park with Tidelands Park?
And we're not dealing with lateral access in those locations. We're dealing with them up along the Embarcadero area. Further up, we don't have the lateral access component connecting that other section. We haven't done that. That's not part of the lateral access scope of work that we've worked out with Michael Baker.
So then there's not going to be a lateral access requirement in that area.
I don't know that that's not the case. There might be a requirement, but we're not mapping out like we are along the Embarcadero area where the lateral access is going to go and evaluating that in the same level of detail. There might be a requirement that they have it in those locations, and it could be on the water, or it could be on land. You could require a dedication along the land frontage if you wanted to. It's fine. So that's probably going to be more of a policy and a discussion item as we get down to those areas.
Right.
Question. On the isn't there a California, the California coastal access? They want a trail or access to the coast all the way down the coastline.
California Coastal Trail.
Coastal Trail. Thank you. Would a lateral access from Tidelands Park to the state park be somehow involved in that?
Well, the California Coastal Trail can run along the bayside access, can run up on streets, can run on sidewalks, it can go along all of those things.
Doesn't have to be right on the beach.
Doesn't, no.
Okay.
It's not. They have it's mapped in many areas, and it goes inland some and runs down streets and things like that to provide connectivity where it doesn't otherwise exist.
I was trying to think of a reason to hurry up to make a lateral access from Tidelands Park to State Park.
We could. I mean, it's something that the GPAC, if you're interested in, should certainly discuss. And if we want to put a policy into either the general plan, LCP, and or zoning code to do that when development comes forward, certainly that can happen.
Susan, did you have a question?
No, I think it's been addressed. Thanks.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. No. I just think if we're going to require lateral access, we ought to have an idea of how that's going to work. You know what I'm saying? In other words, where are we going with that at the end? Okay, then moving on to new business, item number C1. We have a status update and two items: the zoning administrative provisions and the ESHA discussion, which are pretty dissimilar from one another. So I think maybe the best way to do this would be to go ahead and have the staff report up through the administrative provisions. At that point, then we can open the discussion for public comment and then bring it back for discussion here. And in the interest of efficiency, I would ask that we write down our questions and try to save them for after the public comment period. So with that, then, I will turn it over to Amy, Martha, and Scott to take us through this. Go ahead, Amy.
Hi, everybody. Oop. My clicker is not working. Am I too far? That's a good question. How do you turn it on?
There you go. That should help.
Okay, like Chair Teff said, I'll do a brief introduction and then I'll turn it over to Martha Miller with RRM. And then we'll be hearing a presentation from Rincon on the ESHA layer update. Since we were here last time, not a lot of changes in this status update. We are still working away on the draft elements of Plan Morro Bay. And the zoning code, you will be hearing tonight about the administrative provisions, and then the other two sections will come to you a little bit later this year. And we're also getting started on the notice of preparation for the environmental impact report. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Martha to talk about the administrative provisions.
Thank you. And just to kind of get us into the zoning code update portion of the project, I like to kind of remind ourselves of why we're here and why we're undertaking it and why the city decided to pursue the project. So the purpose of the zoning code update portion of the project is to update the zoning code so that it's consistent with and implements the general plan and the local coastal land use plan that you're working on, promoting high quality design, responding to community concerns, updating it so it really reflects current practices, current uses, current development trends, that it provides clear decision-making protocols, complies with state and federal law, and overall is clear, concise, and easier to use and understand. So the last time I was here, we presented on kind of a summary of what we found in our initial kind of analysis and assessment of your code, and covered kind of the big picture ideas for the approach moving forward. What we'll be going over tonight is the first of 3 sets of preliminary draft regulations. And the zoning ordinance is quite a large document. It's fairly dry. It is technical. It's regulations. So we break it into chunks so that they're more digestible. And so we'll start tonight with administration and permits. And then, as Amy said, later we'll be coming forward with citywide regulations and then the district regulations. And those are more closely tied to individual general plan policies, so we need some of that to be fleshed out before we can really get into those. We'll get comments from the public, your committee, the Planning Commission, from staff, from others on these sets of preliminary regulations. We'll make revisions to them and then package them all together into a complete draft, and we'll look at those again with your committee and the public and the commission. And then it's after that would be formal review and adoption. So we have some process that we're going through. So the first chunk, it really is kind of the driest section of the zoning code. It's very procedural. A lot of it is really steeped in government codes, state law, existing practices. So a lot of it is carrying forward what the city already does or what the city is required to do. It does have the provisions for administration of the zoning code, so who's responsible for making decisions, what those processes are. It's not identifying what projects go through that process, it's just identifying the process if you are required to have a certain permit or a certain review. And so the draft is really intended to maintain the bulk of your existing provisions. There's not wholesale changes to your processes happening. Consolidate them to be more user-friendly. There's a lot of redundancy and you're not sure what's the same and what's different in your code now. You think you read about public notice in one part, and then you read about it again, and then you read about it again, and there's no kind of certainty of what actually applies or what the difference is or how this occurs. So there's a lot of consolidation of common procedures, and then just trying to organize everything, and then reflect some best practices, respond to any concerns that have been brought up. So it begins with the first chapter is the planning authorities, and this is really to identify the basic roles and functions of the authorities that are tasked with administering their code. And it just identifies, again, the basic functions of those bodies under this code. So you might be looking at it and say, oh, well, they look at subdivisions as well. Well, subdivisions is in another code, and that's why it's not in here. It's really just the planning authorities for the zoning code. The second chapter is common procedures. So these are those uniform procedures that multiple permits that apply to multiple permitting processes. So how do you apply for an application? The public notice, how does that occur? Public hearings, what are the effective dates? This is the chapter that appeals are located, so those procedures for appeals, interpretations, those types of things. The next chapter after that is the zoning clearance, and this really is that check that all licenses, permits, anything go through before they get signed off from planning. And what this is really saying is that planning needs to look at stuff to make sure it conforms to the zoning code. That's what it is. It's a zoning clearance. You can comply with the ordinance. If there's any discretionary approvals, staff has looked at those conditions and requirements. Then the second is design review, and design review is required for all projects that require permit except for the replacement of exterior materials, so like of similar materials. And this section includes reference to design guidelines, which would really house the detailed design direction in there. So that would be in the design guidelines as well as the design and development standards in other parts of the code. This does have design review considerations and criteria, and these are more general, and these are to give direction in the review of design review. What are you looking at, and what are that criteria you're evaluating against? But again, it's consistency with design guidelines and other standards in the code. And then who conducts design review is really split between the director and the planning commission. So the planning commission is going to have design review for any multi-unit development with 5 or more units, new non-residential development, and also additions to non-residential development that's more than 10% of floor area or more than 2,000 square feet. And then they would also do the design review for anything else that just goes to planning commission anyway. So if they're already making the decision on the project, they're going to conduct design review along with that. And then the director conducts design review for anything that doesn't fit into those categories. There is a public hearing required for the design review for the planning commission, but not for design review by the director. But what the director can do is always elevate the decision to the planning commission. So maybe there's something that for some reason isn't going to the planning commission. The director feels that there's enough interest in it or controversy, the director can elevate it to the planning commission. Then there's coastal development permits, and this establishes those procedures for coastal development permits. When a coastal development permit is required, that's going to be addressed in the coastal zone provisions. So this is just the procedures for this. And this is really established in the Coastal Act of how this is processed. But the director is the review authority for any development that does not result in more than 4 units, does not demolish more than 2 units, does not constitute major public works, and that's there's a specific definition for that, and that does not require review by the planning commission, and also is not appealable. That is not coastal appealable development. And then planning commission is the review authority for the rest, which is will end up being quite a bit, but we'll get in that when we get to the coastal zone. Then there's chapters on use permits, and that's the conditional use permits, which are reviewed by the planning commission. They do require public notice and public hearing. And then there's minor use permits, which are reviewed by the director. There is public notice. There is no public hearing. But again, the director may refer something to the planning commission if it feels that that level of review is warranted. And then there's temporary use permits, which these are the permit procedures for temporary uses that require a permit. So again, in another section, we'll talk about what temporary uses are and what the standards are for those uses and what requires a permit. And then these, again, are just those procedures for getting a permit or going through that process. Public notice is required, and that's consistent with what you have now. We did include findings regarding nuisances and impacts to circulation and those types of things. So specific findings where the director would make and can apply conditions of approval to achieve those findings. So it gives some flexibility with that. Then there's modifications, which is really similar to what your current process is of minor variances. And the reason we call them something different is because variances are defined in the government code. And so calling them minor variances just causes some confusion of how those interplay with the government code on variances. But it's similar to your current provisions. It gives opportunities where the director, or if the project's going to the planning commission can allow some minor modification to standards, or locational, developmental, operational standards, up to 10%. And that's to give, if there's something happening on the property or something that of the nature of the development, that having that flexibility makes sense. The director or the planning commission could approve that. It's not allowed for lot area, width or depth, or density. So those cannot be waived. This is also the process where when we get into the standards and there's some flexibility in that standard that says, well, the director may allow a modification of parking spaces pursuant to, and then this would be the process for that as well. Then there's reasonable accommodation. These provisions are for compliance with state and federal law, access to housing, fair housing policy, ADA requirements, and this really carries forward your current code, which was recently adopted to be consistent with those laws. Then there's the variances, and so these are areas where variation is more than what would be allowed in the modification, and there's some very specific standards that need to be made for variances. And the big, kind of the common example we use where variances are appropriate is if you had a 50-foot wide lot and there's a huge boulder in the middle of it. That's nothing that you did. If you had to meet all the setback requirements of everyone else, your specific lot would be treated differently. So it makes sense to give a variance to those standards because there's this certain circumstance that really deprives you of having the same rights as others. So that's a common procedure. Then there's emergency permits. And those are your existing provisions really for issuing a permit in case of an emergency where the regular permit process can't take place. And this is primarily, it can be anywhere. It's important in the coastal zone, especially because you have the two agencies that you're working with. So it puts out those parameters for when the director can make the decision. There are required findings such that the nature of the emergency is such that we can't do the normal permit process. And then there's some notification as well to your city council and the Coastal Commission and some working together as much as possible. The chapter on development agreements really allows the city to implement some provisions of the government code that allow the government entities to enter into these agreements with private parties. Then there's the provisions for amendments to the general plan, the zoning code, and map. Again, largely, this is consistent with the government code on it. The Planning Commission makes the recommendation to the City Council. The City Council makes the legislative action for that. And then amendments to the local coastal program, where basically you follow the procedures of a general plan or zoning code amendment, but then then it gets forwarded to the Coastal Commission for certification. Finally, provisions for zoning upon annexation. So if the city were going to annex, these are just the procedures for zoning that unincorporated territory before it would be annexed. And then enforcement. So expanding on your current enforcement provisions, including provisions to allow the city to record a notice of violation against the property if violations aren't addressed. It helps with enforcement and by recording on the property, and then once that the violation is taken care of, then it would be removed or something recorded saying that the violation had been taken care of. And then also the provisions for revocation of permits if the terms of permits are violated. So that's an overview of all the processes and the permit procedures, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Exciting stuff.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bob.
Let's allow public comment.
Oh, okay, great. Absolutely.
Time for questions.
Great.
So this is a new business item. Anyone who would like to speak with this? Thank you. This is a new business item. Anyone who would like to speak to this, please come forward. We'd love to hear from you.
Betty Winholtz again. Just 4 comments, and maybe one's kind of a general one. I feel like, and this is where my interest in having a side-by-side comparison from old to new would be, I feel like the director of planning, whether he or she seems to have more authority than that position currently does, and that concerns me. I've always looked to the Planning Commission to be that authority. They have the feel for our town. They live in our neighborhoods. No offense to whoever the planning director might be, but they tend to not live here, and they don't have a feel for our neighborhoods and compatibility. Or at least that hasn't been my experience. Also, I would comment, and this idea, a very specific example is allowing the director to say anything up to 4 units. That's a new thing. I don't think that's in our current zoning, and I think that that's taking. Is it really? Okay. I would change that then, and I would move it down. I know that. At 5 units, you can start to ask for low-income housing, but I didn't know that that was something that the director could do, and I apologize for not knowing that. I have concerns about using the term guidelines or design guidelines. We also have tree design guidelines. Those are not mandatory for the developer. They're things that are wish lists, and they don't make them do those things. And so I'm hoping that, I thought that we would, in this process, take those guidelines and make them really laws and rules and take them out of the term of guideline and make them more firm. And I think that that is my last comment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bill.
Good afternoon again, Bill Martini. Just a quick comment. I'm not sure if this is the right place for it or not, but just as far as zoning densities as they come up, I think one thing that should be considered is quality of life as opposed to over-densifying areas, because I know they're talking about upgrading a lot of the densities in town. So I think you have to kind of take in local residents and the quality of life as opposed to, just kind of squeezing more and more tighter more things into a tighter area. So just a thought as the zoning densities come up to just weigh one against the other on quality of life compared to over-densifying. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to speak on this? Seeing none, then we'll close public comment, bring it back to the commission. Are there any questions for staff?
So I have a question. So how different is this from our current administrative procedures in general and also specifically? And one example I'm thinking of is the pre-zoning prior to annexation. Is that something we have in place now, or is that a new thing?
It's in place now.
It is? Okay.
No, that's a normal process.
Okay.
You don't really want to pre-zone. I think our existing code actually says if you don't pre-zone it, then it's supposed to be RA, which made no sense to me. I said, if you're going to annex something into the city, you should tell the city and the residents what it's going to be. So we removed that, so it's not a default. It's like, you're going to come into the city, you're going to tell us what you are, and the city's going to help with that process.
So the general purpose and review of this is to make it more streamlined from an operational standpoint. Is that correct? And kind of clean
more
it up?
streamlined, more clear. Our current processes are not clear. I mean, a lot of the things we do are by past practice. If you were to walk into the city, read our zoning code the way it is right now, you probably wouldn't know what the process is. That's not a great situation to be in, and so we've tried to work through this to provide clarity. That's the biggest issue, that I think the biggest hurdle that we've had is to try to make the processes clear so anybody can pick it up, read it, and understand where they're going. And so that's been, my biggest wish here is to make that happen, because our code isn't that way now. And so that does no favors to the residents that live here or the folks that are looking to do development here or any of those types of things. And so we're trying to improve that.
Okay. And then in terms of some public comment regarding ESHA areas and other things that don't seem to be compliant with existing maps, how do you plan to respond to those questions and comments?
We're going to talk about ESHA later.
Not having the side-by-side maps is obviously.
We have to dive into them a little bit deeper. Certainly we'll go look into the comments that were made. That's what we're.
So will you specifically respond to each of the comments in some fashion?
We'll certainly look into them.
For the ESHA analysis, we definitely are overlaying the existing with the draft layer. That's not part of the zoning, so that's not related to
I understand
comment.
that. Yeah. In one of the general comment, in terms of project objectives, we keep talking about character of neighborhood and design guidelines. I'm hoping that when we get to the zoning portion, that will be talked about a lot. I know it's important to a lot of people. Not sure that it's in place now. You would probably know more than I about this, Bob, but just want to emphasize how important that is to the community.
Certainly, we have existing design guidelines, and we're intending to keep them. We're not intending to wrap them into the zoning code at this portion. Problem with it becomes they're a living, breathing document, and it's nice that the Planning Commission could take them up and the City Council could take them up for review on every couple of years to see what's working and what's not. That's sort of where we've been with it right now. And early on, I thought absolutely we're going to update the zoning code and we're going to put them in there. But the process to fix them and change them over time is a long process, and a lot of times they're tied in. We'd have to make sure that they're not part of the LCP piece, so Coastal Commission doesn't have to certify it because their guidelines. That's our values as a city. We don't really need the Coastal Commission to weigh in about what those would be, and so it's a faster and easier and cleaner process to have them. At least I've come to that conclusion now, to have them outside as a separate document. And we have design guidelines in a number of different things. We have our existing residential design guidelines. We have our downtown and waterfront strategic plan that's in a draft format now that has design guidelines in it that we're probably going to build off of, at least for the commercial component. It's our starting point for design guidelines, and so that's what it's talking about. When looking at design guidelines, we'll be looking to those documents, and some of our specific plans in town also have design guidelines in them, and so it's good to have the reference in there so everybody knows that there might be other policies that are out there and to go look to those. So that's kind of where we're at with those. We did initially, as Ms. Winholtz indicated, I was gung-ho about putting them in the zoning code, and then started looking at what that would mean over time as we've updated and looked at it and developed the existing residential design guidelines. And it's not a process that works very well. It's better to have a standalone document. It's more flexible that way and easier to change.
Okay, and then one last thing. There are public comments about zoning issues with specific properties. What is the process for notifying property owners when their land use or zoning is changing?
Well, the process is to come here and pay attention to the process. You can sign up for the GPAC notification list, notify me, and so you can see what items are on the agenda as they move forward, and so you would know then by looking through them. We haven't come up with a process to notify individual folks. We haven't gotten to zoning yet.
Yeah, but when we do get to zoning, obviously there are going to be property owners that might be impacted by changes, and it seems to me the city should be notifying them.
Fair enough. I mean, that might be something that we can do. We should probably wait till we get to that point to see what the ramifications are, what zoning changes, how it impacts the properties and those types of things.
If they're in the process now, though, it's on, or it looks like it's on, the light's on. Here,
Talk louder.
how's that?
It's better.
That one's dead. If they're in the process now, though, of doing some kind of development construction, they've got their permits in, you couldn't go back next year and say, sorry, you did all this work, but we just changed the zoning on you, right?
Yeah, basically, once you've submitted your application, it's been deemed complete, you're subject to the codes that are in place when your application is deemed complete, effectively.
If I could just address the design guideline thing a little bit. There are quantitative measurements that relate to design, okay, such as maximum lot coverage, perhaps floor area ratio, perhaps, what the second story can be what percent of the first story, and those things will probably end up in the zoning code.
Yeah.
But the actual design guidelines, if you look at them, it's kind of like a catalog. Here's all the things that you can do to make this more compatible. And the truth of the matter is, if anybody did all of the things that are in the design guidelines, it would probably look pretty terrible. It would look like a Frankenstein house. So that's another reason why they need to remain a little flexible in terms of the non-quantitative part of it.
Okay. I have a couple of issues. And the design guidelines, I think, I agree. I think it's really I think we want to leave some room for creativity and for site specificity when you have a particular development. So I think the guidelines are a good idea to let people know what's expected, but I think we do want to leave room for creativity and interesting things that people might come in and do, or trade-offs that they might make for things, and not make them quite necessarily prescriptive. The other thing is, as far as the zoning density, most of the comments we've had in this process have been people who want things to be less dense than a proposal. And we have some other items, and these are hard conversations. We have some other items where we want affordable housing, and we want, people to be able to afford to live here. And I don't, I think in different places that may be applied in different ways, but I think at some point we have to have a really hard conversation about, how if we want to have those kind of things, how are those things going to happen? And I don't know if that means less rules, more rules, putting it in certain places where it's maybe specifically better suited or whatever. I know there are problems with increasing density in some places, and so we don't want to ignore those. But I think we just need to have we haven't really discussed too much the trade-offs between those things, or how are we actually going to get to having more affordable housing options in this city. So I'm not sure when it's appropriate to do that, but I'm sort of waiting till, and I don't know if that's the zoning, but I think we need to be mindful of that, and I want to make sure we have an opportunity to have that conversation.
Okay. Well, Susan's kind of taken us from questions to comments, so why don't we just go ahead and do that? Susan, let's start with you. And
I did have one question relating to public comment. The issue of having the director have authority if it's 4 units or less versus going to Planning Commission. And I don't have an opinion either way. I mean, it makes sense in terms of, I do actually read the Planning Commission log of all the projects that are in the Pike, and it's huge. It's a lot to get through. And, I could see somebody wanting to build a 4-plex, or 2 duplexes on a lot, and not necessarily needing to go through Planning Commission. So just wondered if you had any responses or opinions, or...
It was that policy is one that we didn't propose to change, and we don't get a lot of those. I'd be happy if we had more, quite frankly. But I think probably we've had just a couple of ones that were up to 4 units, maybe 2 since I've been here. So it's not something that comes up all that frequently, and it was really just. That's interesting. Someone's Skyping us.
The aliens have landed.
Yeah. So I don't know. It was never a proposed change. There hasn't been issues. I haven't been here that long. I've been here about a little over 3 years. There hasn't been any issues since I've been here as it relates to those types of developments. I'm not going to say that hasn't been, what's happened in the past. I don't have that, that historical knowledge. So yeah, that's certainly something that could be changed if there was a thought there that was a problem. One of the things we tried to look at here is creating processes that are a little more explicit about where things go, and making sure that it's clear what is handled at staff level and what is handled at the Planning Commission level, and. In looking at some of the things we take to Planning Commission now, they probably should be and should be handled by staff, so they can spend a little more time on a little bit more meaty items than, somebody wants to add a 200 square foot bathroom to their master bedroom and it doesn't meet the parking requirements, so it needs a parking exception, has to go to Planning Commission. That's probably not something we need to be taking to the Planning Commission all that often. We would notice it normally, and so getting some of those things out of the pipeline and putting them back down at staff level, because we do the same noticing, I think is appropriate. So if in that sense, more authority moving over to the director side of things, meaning staff, things like that we looked at, but nothing major, really. And this was, again, something that we just proposed to remain the same. We didn't propose to change it.
I have no more comments.
As the only other process thing I would say is just to make sure when we're doing things like separating out the administrative procedures that we do enough cross-referencing Sometimes it's very hard to you're in one section and some piece of information is important to you in some other section, but it's hard to connect the dots sometimes when you're trying to get through these. So I guess I would pay special attention to other reference tools like indexes and then also cross-referencing back and forth. I think that would be very helpful.
From the beginning of this process, I beat them over the head with that. Meaning, that's because our current documents don't have it. So it's a very astute observation on your part, and one that I'm very interested in as well.
Well, I guess probably because of being on the Planning Commission and sort of being in the thick on this, I have several comments. The first one has to do with design review. One of the main concerns throughout this entire process has been neighborhood compatibility, and therefore, I feel strongly that there should be Planning Commission review for those single-family residences which are inconsistent in size with the surrounding neighborhood. And that could be defined in a number of different ways. You could say above a certain square footage. That's a little imprecise, okay? The best way, and I don't know if our new computer system is going to be able to handle this or not, but say the Planning Commission needs to do design review on all single-family residences which exceed 125% of the FAR of residences within 1,000 feet of the proposed site.
That would be a tremendous amount of work.
It's not that sophisticated.
No, in the records and I found that the records, if you look through the county records on some of this stuff, they're not accurate. So I mean, it literally is at this point would be a dive into each one of the individual files to figure that out. I mean, it would. An application. So, I mean, continue. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just thinking out loud. I shouldn't have done.
No. And this is not a totally formed concept, but even if we have to go with a blunt square footage, okay, I think there needs to be a threshold where the Planning Commission gets to look at it and say this works for the neighborhood or this doesn't work for the neighborhood.
Yeah, I've certainly seen policies where they put limitations like that, like anything over 2,500 square feet goes to Planning Commission. I've seen policies like that, so we could do something that would be much easier to implement. Okay. The 1,000 square foot, I can't even imagine how much staff time that would take. We wouldn't be able to process applications in a timely manner. We probably wouldn't meet Permit Streamlining Act requirements.
Some of these sophisticated GIS, you just draw a circle and it tells you, kind of, this is the average within that circle. But the only sort of detail that I would include there is we should be looking at total conditioned area, not livable, because we've seen houses come in with like 900 square foot garages, which certainly adds to the bulk of the.
Maybe within the exterior walls of the structure, so it doesn't differentiate between habitable and non-habitable space, so it picks up garages and storage areas and things like that.
The other issue I had was in the modification system section. According to this, you can get modifications to setbacks, parking, fences, lot coverage, height, landscaping, transparency, and other standards, all through the administrative process. I think it should be limited to one. You can get one of those through the administrative process. If you want modifications of more than one of the standards, then you need to come to the Planning Commission. And in addition, I really don't think height should be in there. Height is a very sensitive subject here in Morro Bay. Views are important, and I think allowing structures that are built from now on to avail themselves of this modification that was not previously available is sort of a double standard. So again, I would, if there needs to be a modification to height, I think that should be a planning commission decision. And the other issue I have is with the findings, particularly finding B, which to me is very loose. The finding has to be that there are no alternatives to the requested modification that could provide an equivalent level of benefit to the applicant. Now, it seems to me there are situations where a different design could carry out the intended function of the building perfectly well, but could be interpreted as not providing the same level of benefit. For example, let's say I'm in an area that has a 25-foot height limit and I want to go to 27.5 feet simply because I want 12-foot ceilings. Well, the answer to that is simple. Build 11-foot ceilings, so I would like to see that equivalent level of benefit replaced with something that says that would allow the proposed structure to fulfill its intended purpose or something like that. So it's not simply a matter of, well, I want to do it that way. It's a matter of it needs to be done that way in order to work. So that's sort of my issues with that. And then the other issue I had was emergency permits. I mean, I understand the idea, but there are things around town that have been built with an emergency permit like 10 years ago. In other words, if there's a need to do something on an emergency basis, okay? Let's say, I think the collapse of the seawall down at the boatyard is a good example. Obviously, something had to be done about that. But here we are, X number of years later, and we're just now getting around to redoing it.
It's been in the process the entire time. It's just what it's taken based on that leaseholder and negotiations through the city and the overall permitting process for that. It's taken that long for those reasons.
Understandable. But is there a requirement that if you get an emergency permit to do something, that you need to follow up then and obtain the appropriate regular permit?
Correct.
Okay.
That is the process.
That sets my mind at ease. Okay. So those are all the comments I have on that. Anyone else that would like to?
Just as a follow-up to your discussion about the square footage review, I would actually be in favor of setting a specific square footage that if you go above that, it needs to come to Planning Commission. And I don't think it matters how big the lot is. You have a big lot, you can fill it with a house. I don't think that's what our goals are for this community. So I would just set it, I don't know whether 2,500, 3,000, I don't, you're on the commission, you know what you see and what people want to do. And I agree that the idea of all-inclusive with the walls, so again, if it's a 900 square foot garage, that's included in what you're footprinting on that land.
I wonder if there's some in-between kind of thing where you can say, well, if the property is this size, anything above this square footage has to go. But if you've got, 3 acres or 4 acres, you're going to have a lot less impact with a 2,000 or 2,500 square foot house than if you have, a tenth of an acre. And I'm just wondering if that that may be a little too much splitting of hairs, but maybe something like that would make sense.
This is true, Susan, but there are also, if you drive around and look, there are also neighborhoods in Morro Bay which are characterized by relatively large lots with relatively small houses and big yards on them. That's the character of the neighborhood. So saying that you can build a bigger house on a bigger lot may in fact not be consistent in those neighborhoods.
I'm not saying that you'd have to, that you should exempt them from any of the other, lot coverage, whatever other things are in the guidelines, but it just seems logical to me that you could be a little less stringent if you've got just more room around you. I understand what you're saying as well, and so it still should have to be compatible with the neighborhood, but the question is, what level of review does it need to have? And
yeah, I was going to say, remember, we're not prohibiting those larger houses. We're simply saying they need to be looked at a little more carefully.
I think if I can summarize kind of the takeaway is that to establish some level of design review threshold for single-family residences to go to the Planning Commission, and it may be a square footage or an FAR, but I think we can have the discussion of the details when we have the standards as well in place, and we'll look at predominant lot sizes and house sizes, and I think we can have a more informed discussion and kind of work at it together that way.
But we have to put the concept in here. We have to put the...
No, this is just the preliminary draft. Again, we're going to be revising these and bringing them back all together, so we can make that revision. You don't need to decide today. No pressure.
On the square footage, I think is what. If we go down that road, you don't need to make the decision today. We can show you options and maybe look at and see. It might be probably worth a look back and what have we been approving at the staff level? What are the sizes of the houses? What do they look like? What's happened over the last few years anyway? That would probably be interesting information for you to have to make those decisions, as opposed to it's 2,500 square feet like I threw out. I mean, that was just a random number. I didn't base it on anything. So.
So we have exhausted this topic. Then let's move on to the second part of our discussion, which is basically ESHA.
Great. So I have here next to me Meg Perry from Rincon, and also in the seats here Colby Boggs, and they are here to present on the draft ESHA layer update, environmentally sensitive habitat areas, and I am going to turn it over to Meg.
Maybe we should turn the name tag around. There you go. So I don't think she's...
That way no one will be asking Martha about ESHA. I'm Meg Perry, and I'm here to talk to you about the ESHA baseline report that we provided. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. The format of the presentation is going to more or less follow the outline of the report. We're going to start with the introduction and the regulatory framework that defines ESHA, and then move through our methodology in reviewing ESHA in Morro Bay, starting with our literature review and existing data sets, and then we'll go through the categories that we defined for ESHA, and then we have an interactive map format to take a closer look at the mapping that was done. I know there was a comment about the print maps. There's so many categories it can be hard to tell one feature from another, and so I think that interactive map may help with that. So to start off, the Coastal Act defines environmentally sensitive area as areas in which plant or animal life or their habitats are either rare or especially valuable because of their special nature, role in an ecosystem, and which could be easily disturbed or degraded by human activities and developments. And I think the example that's on the screen is probably familiar to most people in Morro Bay. This is an example of a snowy plover nest on the left and an adult on the right. There's a number of other Coastal Act sections that play into ESHA, and also some sections in the California Code of Regulations. So starting with wetlands, which are one type of ESHA, the Coastal Act defines wetlands a little bit differently than some of the other regulatory agencies, such as CDFW or the Army Corps of Engineers. For coastal wetlands, we're talking about lands that are periodically covered or permanently covered with shallow water, That includes saltwater marshes, freshwater marshes, open or closed brackish water marshes, swamps, mud flats, fens, pickleweed marshes, and so on. And then the California Code of Regulations goes on to clarify that wetlands can include areas that don't have vegetation or where you don't have hydric soil. So you may have only the water or you may have only the vegetation. As a result, usually of drastically fluctuating water levels, it can be caused by soil chemistry that's challenging for plants. But the bottom line is, in order to have a wetland in the coastal zone, you don't necessarily have to have all three of the parameters that the Army Corps would be looking for. And then we also look at a section of the Coastal Act that deals with marine resources. This section is specifically regarding maintaining, enhancing, and restoring marine resources, gives special protection to areas and species that have special significance, either biologically or economically. It requires uses of the marine environment to be carried out in a manner that sustains that biological productivity and to maintain healthy populations of species of marine organisms. And one of the reasons we look at this for ESHA is that what happens in the watershed and what happens in the nearshore environment has an influence on the deep water marine environment. Then we also look at a section of the Act that deals with biological productivity and water quality. And this is a similar concept where, what happens in the watershed, what happens in the nearshore environment has an effect on productivity and water quality. So the goals here are to maintain that biological productivity in coastal waters, streams, wetlands, estuaries, lakes, to maintain optimum populations of marine organisms, to protect human health, minimize adverse effects on water quality, depletion of groundwater, encourages wastewater reclamation, and maintenance of natural vegetation buffer areas, including riparian habitats. And then finally, a key section of the Act deals with environmentally sensitive habitat areas and adjacent developments. So environmentally sensitive habitat areas, or ESHAs, are protected against significant disruption of the habitat values. These areas are only to be used for those uses that are dependent on the resources. Development that's adjacent to ESHAs is to be sited and designed to prevent impacts which would significantly degrade the ESHA. And then the development needs to be compatible with the continuance of that habitat and associated recreational uses. So I'd like to give you a quick overview of our methodology. We started by looking at the existing ESHA maps, the existing LCP, and a number of existing published reports and data sets, and compiling, there's quite a few spatial data sets out there that already exist that have mapped resources at quite a variety of scales. So many of the national data sets are not looking at the local level and may not be appropriately detailed, but they do give you some information. And then we reviewed kind of the current land cover conditions, looking at recent aerial photos, our knowledge of the area, and also driving surveys, and where we had access on public lands, we also looked on the ground. And then we pulled all of this data together in a geographic information systems package and annotated new polygons based on what we had seen in the field, what we found in the published data sets, and what we can see on the aerials. And then from that, we produced updated ESHA maps. So I'd like to review some of the source information, particularly because some of the maps that are in the report are not data that we created, it's data that's published, and it was to show kind of some of the sources that we looked at. So that would include the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a national wetlands inventory. U.S. Geological Survey has a national hydrography data set. We looked at federally designated critical habitat from both Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service. We looked at the Essential Fish Habitat Mapper, a number of habitat connectivity maps, CDFW publishes the California Natural Diversity Database, and that does include a spatial data set. We looked at the current general plan and LCP, and a couple of publications from the Morro Bay National Estuary Program, including a 2010 publication that was an atlas of sensitive species of Morro Bay, as well as a number of the eelgrass reports. So as part of that review, we did pull together a large number of existing layers, wetlands, critical habitat, connectivity, records of special status species, sensitive natural communities that are already known in the area, and then rookeries, roosts, nest sites, and overwintering sites. So looking at these data sets one by one, this is the map that's on the screens also in the report. It is the National Wetlands Inventory and Hydrography data sets. And it identifies wetlands, coastal streams, riparian areas, the Morro Bay and estuary, the Pacific Ocean, mapped at kind of a broader scale than we might do for a city level mapping effort, but it does provide some valuable information. We looked at final designated critical habitat polygons. There's a number of species that have designated critical habitats in Morro Bay, and these include the South Central California Coast steelhead distinct population segment, California red-legged frog, Morro shoulderband snail, tidewater goby, leatherback turtle, and western snowy plover. We also looked at published habitat connectivity models, and Morro Bay is on the edge of a identified connectivity corridor that connects the southern part of the Los Padres National Forest up to the Ventana Wilderness. There's also local wildlife corridors that would be, open areas between lots. Often stream corridors are used as wildlife movement. And then we pulled all the records from the California Natural Diversity Database, and as you can see on these two figures, on the left we have wildlife, on the right we have plants and vegetation communities. There are quite a number of records from the area, and you'll see that some of the circles on there are really large. Those generally indicate older records where there wasn't GPS coordinates, so it would say something like collected in Morro Bay. And so CDFW maps those really broadly, so it doesn't give you a lot of information about exactly where it occurs, but it tells you that there's suitable habitat somewhere in the area. We also looked at existing records for rookeries, peregrine nest sites, western snowy plover, other nesting birds, and monarch overwintering habitat, and it does sound like we may need to get a little more information on a couple of updated heron rookeries. And then when we compiled all of this information together, we tried to classify the ESHA into three broader categories. With so much information, you run the risk of having so many categories that it becomes a little bit hard to use. So we basically split into three broad categories, looking at aquatic resources and wetland habitat. We looked at other types of sensitive natural communities, and then we looked at other breeding and overwintering sites that weren't already captured in those first two categories. So aquatic resources and wetland habitats include a wide range in the Morro Bay area. So we have rivers and streams, and those can include ephemeral streams that only run right after it rains and they stop after a few days or a few weeks, all the way up to perennial waterways or seasonal with perennial pools, which would be like Choro Creek, for example. Often these rivers and streams have willow woodland or willow scrub riparian habitat associated with them. And if you remember back when we talked about the definitions of wetland, just having that one type of vegetation is enough in the coastal zone to consider it to be a wetland. We also have the estuary and shallow bay habitats, shallow bay mudflat and eelgrass habitat and tidal channels, particularly at the Choro Creek mouth and into the pickleweed marsh there. Other types of wetlands that are present include the estuarine wetland with the coastal salt marsh and pickleweed mat marsh areas. There's a number of dune wetlands and also some areas of freshwater emergent wetland that are mostly associated either with streams or there's some ponds that have been, one of them's been created, but it now has quite well-developed wetland habitat. Other types of sensitive natural communities, primarily looking on the coastal strand and dune communities for the first few. Coastal strand would be at the immediate shoreline. That provides foraging habitat for western snowy plover, and it also influences feeding grounds for the leatherback tortoise, or turtle rather. Foredune communities that are immediately back from the coastal strand tend to have occasional blowouts and sand movement. They're more active. Back dune communities and stabilized dune scrub. These are communities that tend to have well-developed shrub cover. There's a number of plants and animals that you could find in there that are quite rare in California, and these dune communities tend to be quite sensitive to disturbance. Coastal bluff scrub would be a native scrub that's found not in the dune, but where you have marine terraces and rock outcrop. We also identified the Black Hill Natural Area. It has habitat for a number of sensitive plants, and it has also been previously considered to be ESHA because of its native vegetation community and also the recreational value that's there. Our final category identifies sites that may not have had all three criteria. They didn't necessarily have, breeding and natural vegetation and wetlands, but they had either nesting habitat or some other important overwintering habitat. So these include the rookery sites, such as there's a cormorant rookery at Fairbanks Point, and I understand that the herons have moved on, so we'll be looking to see if we can get that pinpointed. There's also a number of monarch overwintering sites, and looking at some state parks data allowed us to finesse the mapping from what had previously been done. So I have an interactive map set, and I'm going to grab the mouse really quick here. Test the range of the mouse here. Oh, yes, okay. All right. So at the moment, I have the originally mapped ESHA turned on as a layer, and we can turn it back off and take a closer look. But I wanted to take a look here first at an example of where updated aerial imagery has let us be a little bit more precise. So the red line in the hatching here is what was previously mapped at Morrow Creek and Little Morrow Creek. And you can see that that doesn't match up very well with where the creek and the riparian band actually is located. And so we have updated that. If we turn off the original, you can see that it is a much better match now to where those communities are actually occurring. So another area that has been refined somewhat is with regard to some of these roost sites, or rather the overwintering sites for monarchs. Let me turn off the state parks. Okay. So there were some areas that were previously identified here on Black Hill, but that weren't captured, where we now know that there are monarch aggregation sites in the state parks area. And then If we move up and look at the coastal strand, again, you can see that the previous mapping perhaps didn't have the resolution to see the dune, coastal strand, and the four dune communities. And so the updated mapping has allowed us to capture those communities a little bit more accurately. And then we've also been able to differentiate some of these dune wetlands that are in here. Would have been really difficult to see without a good aerial photo. So at this point, I think it might make sense if they're specific, while I have the map up, if there were specific questions regarding the mapping or specific areas that you wanted to look at before we move on, or we can come back to it at the end.
We need to get in public comment, I think, before we
okay.
get too far into discussion.
Okay. So I will switch us back to the PowerPoint presentation and take us through the end of that slide set, and then we can come back into the map if there's a desire to do that.
Thank you.
So from that map set that was created, we would now be looking at creating the land use designations. And so there's a draft figure that's been prepared. I realize it's probably a little difficult to read on the screen, but I believe it's also available in print. I don't know if we can zoom in yet.
So this is the same map that we presented to you in July, but the dark hatching, which is the same thing that Meg was just showing you on the map, but it's all just in black with hatching. So you can see it over the sand spit, for example, and on Morro Rock and along the coast as you go north. That represents the draft ESHA layer. So it gives you kind of a 30,000 foot view of how this matches up with the proposed land uses that we're looking at so far. And as you can see, a lot of what is underneath the ESHA is either open space recreation or harbor navigational, which is water for the most part. There are definitely some other land uses that coexist with the draft ESHA, but this is to give a snapshot of how things are looking at this point.
So the next steps from here include an analysis of what will happen to ESHA under a sea level rise scenario. With sea level rise, some of the communities would be potentially drowned, or there would be type conversion from one type of ESHA to another type of ESHA. We will also be looking at refinements to the draft map set. What's presented in the packet is just a draft, and we're anticipating some refinements. And then the implementation plan. And then I think that brings us to the end of the ESHA slides.
Very good. Thank you very much. At this point, then, I will open this topic for public comment. If anyone would like to speak to this, please come forward.
Thank you, Betty Winholtz. First, I want to compliment that you covered every monarch site that I am aware of in Morro Bay, and that's pretty unusual. So thank you for that. And then my question is, what do you do with the fact that we have an urban forest, in a sense, over our business section? We know we've had a great horned owl that's been living on Morro Bay Boulevard. We know we have red-tailed hawks that live up on Cerrito Peak. And how do you document, or does that come into play with ESHA or not?
Good afternoon again, Bill Martini. I had a couple questions as far as ESHA in the bay itself. I couldn't tell on your latest map what was ESHA in the bay, because I know on the original ESHA maps it shows it off the inn at Morro Bay, a second ESHA out front south of the boat launch, and yet on the previous in your map it showed just ESHA down by the inn And then this map here, I couldn't even tell whether those two ESHAs that were designated are still in your original ESHA map, or if you moved that ESHA over to the sand spit or not. I've been here 45 years. I've never seen a leatherback turtle in the area. I've been surfing. I don't know, by designating the entire harbor as for leatherback, does that mean the entire harbor is ESHA for, does that create ESHA in the entire harbor or not, with this species that is designated? Probably an example of sometimes overlays not being accurate. We have a building that's 30 foot off the bay right now. We fill in within the current floodplain and map, and so we're 30 foot above the bay, can never be flooded, and the federal FEMA map now maps us in the floodplain. So it's kind of critical that if there is leatherback turtles, I'm not saying there are or not, then I can understand the ESHA. If this is just strictly an overlay for the sake of something that's not there, then I think some of these ESHAs should be a little better refined, because the way I was looking at the ESHA map, it almost looked like the entire town had ESHA, with all the circles over it. So I would just say to either better refine or make sure if the entire harbor is ESHA because of the leatherback, that, it'll be known. Thanks.
Kristen Hedlund. In regards to the 10-acre parcel at 3300 Panorama Drive in North Morro Bay, there's a ESHA there, and there's questions about the boundaries of the ESHA and the demonstration you did with the correcting of where the streamline is. I was wondering if you could do that for that piece of property. Thank you.
Anyone else who would like to speak? Okay, let's take a minute. Can you address some of the questions that were brought up?
Sure, yeah.
We have some additional information with the project that's going through the process right now. Had two comments. One related to the red-legged frog, I think previously. And so that shows up on figure 3A.
Okay.
Here. And then I think she was looking at figure 4 and saying, oh, it's red over here, but not over here on the property.
Okay, so let me be clear about what those two figures are in the report. Figure 3 is the records that are held by CDFW, and that's not on this map. Those are the records that are reported to CDFW of observations of the species. And figure 4 is what the federal government has designated as critical habitat for California red-legged frog. It is not necessarily the only places that red-legged frogs could occur. And then...
So it's the tank site there. Yeah, there you go. That's it.
Is this the site? Yes. Okay. So this has been identified, and for stream sites, because we didn't have on-site access to map the actual banks, what we've done is identify the center lines. Because we feel that if we were to go and try to map the bank from an aerial photo, it could create confusion down the road, because there could be a map set that says the bank is here, and then when you go out in the field, that's not actually where the bank is. And so what we've done is identified those center lines. Right. So when an actual project came forward with an ESHA center line designated for a stream, you would need to go through the process of actually defining the actual boundaries of that wetland and the actual on-the-ground ESHA boundaries. Does that clarify the question?
Well, I just wanted to point out that I just wanted to point out that the stream comes down and then it goes around onto the Chevron property and back onto the 3300 property, and I was just thinking that maybe you could update that so people know the actual correct flow of the water as it comes down the hill
differently from what's displayed. Is that what you're suggesting?
When it goes out to the county, under the larger Chevron problem, is that what you're asking?
Well, yeah.
I guess it goes further out.
Well, when it comes down the hill, you could see it goes up and then comes down and around.
Right. So we didn't. Right. So we didn't map portions that were only in the county. Yeah.
But it looks like there may be a little bit in the far northern corner there. In other words, where
we
it
could
comes
take
onto
another
the
look to
property
make
and then
sure
goes off
that
again.
that we matched up to the actual edge of the county. Do you want me to pull up the comparison here?
I don't know if that's more useful or to actually use this to go to that location and see what the is showing next to the
So, and that portion actually is not currently mapped either.
Keep going south.
Yeah.
It's loading. Yeah, I could. Yeah. Right. So we did not map the area that's dredged and maintained as a harbor as ESHA. This, I think, is the site you were asking about here. That is identified as a rookery. It's the Cormorant Rookery that's identified in that location.
I was actually talking a little further north, the upper, where the boats are.
This one?
Yeah.
We did not map that as ESHA in the current map set. We did.
Just out of curiosity, has anybody seen the leatherback turtle?
Not that I'm aware of. So I wanted to touch on that as well. The designation of federally designated critical habitats, a decision that is made by either U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries, and goes through public comment period. It doesn't necessarily mean the species itself is present. There are areas that are thought to be critical for the recovery. And for leatherback, that was actually based on prey items. So what they found is that leatherbacks feed off the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington, and they were originally very focused on breeding sites only, but the populations were continuing to decline, and so National Marine Fisheries Service took another look at it and determined that they needed to also be considering prey items. We didn't necessarily, just because it's designated critical habitat for something that's very broadly mapped like that, that may not necessarily mean that it's ESHA. If you don't have in a specific site all the primary constituent elements that make it designated critical habitat, that would be dealt with under the Endangered Species Act rather than the coastal.
Given that the documents that we're working on with the general plan are meant to not necessarily be set in stone, but more challenging to adjust and change. So you want to get something that's usable, that you don't have to be running to Coastal Commission every time, something comes up. The whole issue of sea level rise and ESHA's changing. How flexible can we build in flexibility with that as we see species populations moving to adjust to those sea level rises and changes? And will this document be able to reflect that, and will we be able to address it without having to go through a whole major review and revisions with coastal? Does that make any sense? Yeah.
So that's kind of built into the process. So what we're trying to do now is better define where our ESHAs are. Our current document's very old and didn't do a great job. And so by identifying where they are, it's to let people know that they're there and to know what to expect if they're going to do development or something in adjacent to these locations. This updated and more concerted effort isn't going to change the fact that you have to do the requisite studies that go along with the things that we're identifying that might be the types of ESHA that are located here to make sure they're doing the proper studies, as opposed to the gotcha when you've been going through the process and then if city didn't catch it, coastal catches it and says, hey, this has dune habitat on it. You didn't do a study for that, or it might have it on there, and then they go through another 6-month process by trying to get that done. We realized that was deficiencies in our current documents, and we wanted to make them better, at least as good as we could get them. So when projects and things did come forward, that we at least people had a better idea that what they might be in for as far as the studies that would go along with addressing the ESHA concerns. And so that's kind of what, when we're done with this, that's what that'll do. Anybody that's doing something adjacent to these areas is going to have to go through the study process. This doesn't take the place of that. It just sort of better defines where those studies are going to be necessary.
Okay, it seems that we're moving on.
Oh, and the sea level rise, yeah.
No, in terms of I just wanted to step in and close public comments, which didn't get done.
I had a question. It seems the southern boundaries of these maps, which are excellent maps, by the way, but the southern boundaries look like they, and I may be misinterpreting this, but they look like they go a little further south than the boundaries of the city.
That's a very interesting point, because when we pulled the data to define our study area boundary, we found that there was a mismatch there as well. And I believe what we chose to do for this round was to map the larger area, because it's easier to clip than to add on.
Okay, because I noticed, for example, a good part of the woodlands that are here seem to, if I'm understanding the map properly, do seem to be the state park areas more so than the city jurisdiction.
And we do have a hatching layer on there showing state park property to differentiate that. My understanding is that the coastal zone of Morro Bay does include a portion of the state park, and if that's incorrect, then we can, looks like that's correct.
Yes.
Okay. I guess I was wondering if there was any particular, I'm not sure I mean know what question to ask about that, but other than observing it, but is there any particular implications for where we're going on this that we've included those other areas in here in the state park?
My understanding is that state parks implements their own policies with regard to Coastal Act compliance.
I guess I'm not thinking that we would have any jurisdiction over what goes on in the state park potentially, but is there any implication for what goes on in Morro Bay by the fact that we've included the state park in the whole mapping exercise? And
state park's in the city.
Examination. So the state park is actually in the city?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's in the city. That's why it's mapped.
Okay. Well, okay. Thank you. I was not clear about that, so I appreciate that clarification.
Yeah.
So the areas that are designated as critical habitat for certain species don't really correspond to ESHA. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, there's definitely a correlation there. So snowy plover critical habitat is designated in large portions of the coastal strand in Morro Bay, but that's not the only reason that it would be ESHA. And so we didn't want to make a category that was designated critical habitat that's dealt with at the federal level. It's one element of what might make a community such as the Fore Dune ESHA, that it's critical habitat that's occupied by a listed species. It's very sensitive at this point in time, but it's not just because it's designated critical habitat.
So, in other words, if the endangered species is known to exist there, it would typically be included as an ESHA.
Right.
But if it's only a suitable environment, it might not be. I mean, I'm just looking at the red-legged frog habitat, which is
sure. The red-legged frog habitat included. One of the things to keep in mind with how critical habitats were mapped is they weren't designated uniformly. For some species, they designated large blocks of land, so it wasn't down to the habitat level. It was more geographic, so it was like a region of the state. For other species, they were much more specific in what areas were designated, and so if you tried to pick, it's designated on a federal map, so the habitat is there. Sometimes you end up with, again, those map scale mismatches. So with the red-legged frog, I believe that this whole area here is designated critical habitat, but the aquatic portion of that is quite limited in this particular area. And upland habitat is also important for red-legged frogs, but without seeing the quality of the habitat out there, it's very difficult from an aerial photo to say, that this absolutely has the primary constituent elements that make up red-legged frog critical habitat. So what we've done is identified the aquatic habitat that we can see from the aerial photo that would be the primary habitat for that species.
Okay. Are there other questions or comments?
I have a question. Permeability in the context of your habitat connectivity, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's going back to, I think, yeah, so these were regional and state scale studies that were done by Caltrans that were looking at connections between large blocks of natural areas and the potential for movement. And as you get closer to urban areas, it's considered to be less permeable for wildlife movement because urban wild interfaces can be very difficult for mammals in particular to move through. And that's why as you get close to Morro Bay here, you can see that you're getting into the lower permeability rating on that map. There's local scale wildlife corridors. Often creek corridors are particularly important for movement in urban areas because they tend to not be developed. Okay. But on a larger scale study, that's not going to be picked up on a map like this.
Okay, thanks.
I just have a couple of comments, sort of more details than anything else, but on Figure 7, the overall map of the eschers, there's a label for breeding and overwintering sites, but they don't show up on the map. So I assume probably just a layer was left out when the map was printed.
Okay. Thanks, that's a good catch.
Just a typo. And the other thing is that in discussing implementation, our current ordinance, zoning ordinance, talks about a 100-foot buffer in rural areas and a 50-foot buffer in urban areas. That methodology admits for considerable controversy. So I think it would be better if we sort of defined, for purposes of ESHA buffers, what we consider to be rural and what we consider to be urban. I remember a year-long knockdown, drag-out fight with the city of San Luis Obispo about what was urban and what was rural. So those are just a couple of details. And Ms. Windholz brought up the issue of the urban forest. As far as I can see, there's no way to deal with that as an ESHA. We would probably need to deal with that in terms of tree policies or somewhere else in the zoning ordinance.
Yeah, that's going to be probably more of it's a good point, Cindy, a case-by-case situation as it arises, as the information becomes, because it's not necessarily information that we'd otherwise have. What usually happens is the project comes forward and someone like Ms. Winholtz comes forward and says, hey, there's owls living over there, and we're like, oh, okay. And then we go, okay, we need to have somebody evaluate that. Are they living there? Are they just passing through? What's the situation going on there? And you have to have that evaluated. So I'm not sure how you pick that up into this type of, would you pick things like that up into this type of document? I mean,
individual nests are usually addressed through Migratory Bird Treaty Act and Fish and Game Code, especially for species that may nest in different locations every year. I have seen for species such as whitetail kite that come back again and again, or eagle nests, that those sometimes are treated as ESHA.
Okay. So
I have one kind of administrative comment. I've noticed in this document that the map of Morro Bay is split into 7 kind of subsets. We've had a lot of map questions over the last year or so in terms of legibility, and I'd like to recommend that all future mapping presentations take this format so that we can actually see the map better. It's a long, narrow city, and just looking at in one map is problematic. Thanks.
Can I make a follow-up on one of the questions? Someone asked about impacts of I think it was Susan, sea level rise in terms of the fluidity of the ESHA mapping, and Meg touched on it in her presentation, but one of the later deliverables in this task will be actually a second ESHA layer that shows the impacts as we know them to be projected right now of sea level rise on the ESHA area.
Very well, then. With that, we will move on to item number D, closing comments from committee members.
I would just like to say, and I think I've said it before, I've really been impressed with the consultants that we've had with this project, both in providing really clear information and I think also in your willingness to hear comments, take notes, make adjustments, come back with them. I know it's a huge process for people in the public to follow too. There's massive amounts of information online, but I think Michael Baker has done a great job with making adjustments all the way down the line and providing those comparisons. I think RRM is doing an excellent job with the zoning, and I was really impressed with Rincon's presentation too. So, good job all the way around, I think. And again, I know sometimes it can be frustrating to the public as they're catching up with some of the stuff, or maybe they've been following all along, but I think it's important for you to know that at any time, submit a written comment, come to a meeting, submit an oral comment. All these folks are taking notes, and we'll make those adjustments as possible and where they can fit in. So, good job.
Yeah, I just kind of like to reiterate the fact that you responded specifically to public comment in the context of this meeting, I think is outstanding, and I'd like to encourage that as much as possible in all of the city's meetings. And I know it's a little more time consuming, but a lot of times when you're standing at the microphone, you feel like your comment is just kind of falls into a black hole. You don't know if it's going to be addressed soon or ever. So the fact that you specifically responded to some public comments until you got to the point where they understood, I think is outstanding. Thank you.
I agree with the comments on for both of those. Basically, there's very high quality work, and also the response to public comment is excellent. I would ask, and sometimes, occasionally, when we get public comment, people talk about the XYZ property, and somehow assuming that other people know what the XYZ property is. And often people give an address or say it's off of Beach Street or something like that. But I find myself occasionally when people are making comments, and I'm very interested in what they have to say, but I'm not exactly sure which property they're talking about. So I guess guess I would urge people when they come to these meetings, I know there's a lot of people who come, who are repeat people who come here, but if there's any way you could I think if you lived here 30 years, I've lived here 10 years, and so I'm not a newbie, but it would be helpful to have just a little more information when you have a comment on a specific property to let us know a little more about where it is, because I am interested and I want to understand, but sometimes I'm not quite sure. I have an idea of where it might be, but I think it would be helpful to get that information.
I agree with everybody's comments before, and especially the last one where, I know where some of the properties are that you talk about, but I don't, when you're talking about the specific issues, I feel like I've come in the middle of the conversation and I don't know what happened before or after. So it would be very helpful to give us more of a background of what your specific problem is or comment is on the area that you're referring to. Thank you.
Just one suggestion, and this was actually brought up by the public as well. For particularly technical type of information, I think it really would be useful to have a side-by-side chart saying, this is what our current general plan says, these are the changes that are being proposed. I think that would make it much easier for people who, don't have our current zoning code memorized to
There's nobody like that.
to see what the essential effects are being proposed.
I think sort of elaborating on that, if there are big changes, like it's going from one thing to something totally different, or any of those particularly really significant changes, I think those we should focus on those kinds of things. I think that I agree with the comment, and I think just highlighting where if there are, there may not be anything. I know where some of these are just adjustments, but if there's anything that is of note where it's really changing a lot, it would be good to sort of highlight that and be able to discuss those situations.
Yeah, and there are many of the documents there really isn't anything to compare with. If we ever had a community baseline assessment before, I'm not aware of it. You know what I'm saying? But for a fairly technical document like the procedures and applications, I think that would be really helpful. So then, Scott, moving along to Community Director.
I want to point out that we're going to do this again in about 2 weeks on the 29th at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, the 29th at 4 p.m. in the Community Center. That's all, the only point I have to make.
That meeting's scheduled to go till 6, is that right also?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So with that, notice it's the next meeting on the 29th. It's not here, it's at the Community Center. So with that, then, we will adjourn to our next regularly scheduled meeting on August 29th at the Morro Bay Community Center. Thank you very much.